Do you mind welcoming everybody on camera?
Hi
I
there.
totally bungled the beginning.
No, happy Memorial Day, everyone. We are getting set up for the first lecture.
3, 2. Oh, we're not live yet. We're gonna be live in just a moment. Sorry, we're having some troubleshooting. Let's see. So bungled.
We're having the opposite of we're shooting trouble, actually.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are now live on Instagram and YouTube. Over here we have Jeneline and
Good morning, everyone.
myself, Julian. Welcome to the first lecture in the new Introduction to, I should say, Western Philosophy lecture series. This is going to be a class on the Pre-Socratics. And if you're joining us for the very first time today, welcome. Every Monday and every Friday, Jeneline and I teach a class. I teach a class on philosophy on Monday. Jeneline teaches a class on
Political economy. Yes.
every Friday. And we also want to say thank you to our patrons, to our wonderful patrons who keep this project going for everybody else.
Yes.
Our classes are 100% free. Anybody can join from anywhere, no matter where you are, how old you are, what your native language is, you can join. And the way that we keep these classes free for everybody is because we have the generous support of our patrons.
Yes.
Now, if you're a patron or you want to become a patron, there are a couple things that you can get for every class, including you can get lecture notes for every class. You can download every class as a podcast. You can get a reading list. We have a Discord where we host 2 live Q&As every week after every class, including after this class. And if you're watching this, we are going to be extending our JXJ Studio tier. That is our premier tier 4 tier on Patreon.
Yes.
Because starting this week, we're going to be posting every class that I teach as a full written out essay, as a full, like, downloadable ebook essay. And our JXJ Studio patrons will get 4 of those essays every month. So they'll get an essay for every class. So if you're watching this and you would rather read this essay, or read this class, I should say. If you don't want to sit here for an hour and you'd like to read this in a written form, you can also get that on Patreon on tier 4.
Yes. Or if you'd like to listen to it as a podcast or listen to the Q&A discussion afterwards as a podcast.
So thank you to our patrons and thank you to our future patrons who are keeping this
Our
project
patrons
alive.
to be.
Jeneline and I, if you don't know us, Jeneline and I started this about a year ago. We launched the Patreon 3 months ago, but we started teaching online a year ago when the pandemic hit, and we decided to take our classes online, and not just for a small group of students, but to make them online and accessible to everybody.
Yes, and speaking of accessible, they are true introductory classes in the sense that you can jump in anywhere. You don't need any previous philosophy knowledge.
Sounds good. Okay, I think we should just jump in.
All right.
I'm feeling raw this morning. I just want to say, I'm feeling raw. It's Memorial Day weekend.
The weather's beautiful.
It's gorgeous weather. Okay, so thank you everybody who's joining us live. We have currently quite a lot of people on IG and a lot of people on YouTube, so thank you. We're just going to launch right in. This is going to be a class on the Pre-Socratics. Although, if you joined the class on last week, the prologue, that's where I laid my cards out on the table. And I said, I'm fundamentally incapable of teaching a summary class. So this is not going to be a summary. Instead, in the prologue, last week's class, I showed you, here are some of my obsessions. Those obsessions are Freudian, they're Lacanian, they're Zizekian. They focus on Hegel's idea of nothingness, constitutive negativity, and all that. And so every class in this series is not going to work as a fully fledged introduction. Instead, it's going to work as, here's what I'm obsessed with. And so this class is going to be the things that I'm obsessed with about the Pre-Socratics, basically. Speaking of laying your cards out on the table, I was reading about magic the other week. That's how I want to introduce this, is by thinking about magic, because I think the Pre-Socratics would have appreciated this, because the Pre-Socratics are mystics. I mean, not all of them, but some of them are mystics. And for example, like Parmenides has this idea of cosmic monism, that everything goes back to like some cosmic sense of oneness. And anyway, so I was reading about magic. I don't know very much about magic, but I was reading about a magician who became very popular in the 1970s in London. and he was really famous for a card trick, a very specific card trick. Now, every magician, first of all, every magician has card tricks in their repertoire. This is not something unusual. In fact, you're probably not really a magician today unless you have a card trick. This is like a difference between magicians and wizards. Like if you ask a wizard for a card trick, they'll be very unhappy with you. But ask a magician for a card trick, and they're going to bust out a deck. And so magicians don't give away their secrets, but within the circle of magicians, they will usually tell each other what are some of the secrets of the trade. As magicians get older, they don't necessarily want to go to their grave holding the secret to their tricks. And a lot of the tricks that magicians use, as you probably are aware of, focus on distraction. We distract somebody. And so let's say that we have a deck of cards, we've actually slipped in a card or something like this. Magicians are very, very
Misdirection.
Misdirection, yeah, that would be the actual word. Yeah, exactly, misdirection. They're very, very good at misdirecting people. I'm very good at misdirecting myself, frankly. And so, but what's curious about this, and there's a name for it, if you're like into magic, I don't know, you can go very deep on this, and I'm not that into it, but there's a card trick that this guy performed that nobody knows how he does it. Still nobody knows how he does it. He's never given away the secret. And this particular card trick, basically the premise is this. The cards are not produced. So the cards are not like in his hand. The cards are not given to somebody. Nobody touches a physical card. Because a lot of these magic shows, the idea is that somebody will
pick a card.
Exactly. Take a number in your head, and then you pick a card, and that's it. And do we have any water here? Oh, wonderful. Okay, hydration check. I'm very, very thirsty.
Well, so he has a deck of cards.
No.
But he
what I just did,
doesn't...
this is how misdirection works. So if you're a magician and you suddenly do something unexpected, like drinking a glass of water, that's where you would produce like the card out of your hand or something. That was what I was trying to demonstrate here. And so what he does with this card trick is that there is no misdirection at all. He simply asks somebody, take a number of a card and a suit in your head, and then he walks over to a table on which there is a deck of cards, and he will pick a card off that table, and that is the card that person thought about. And nobody knows how he does it. In fact, there's a journalist from the New York Times who goes to visit him when he's in his 1990s, because he's like 94 now or something. He lives in London. And he's interviewing him, and he's grumpy. He doesn't want to do the trick, which is part of the performance. And then he says, okay, think of a card. And then he walks over to his desk, and he has like a deck of cards in the desk, and that's where the card is. And he's like 2 off or something. And so the question here is, the reason... It's not going to be a lecture about magic, but there's some principles here that are interesting. The reason that people are so mystified and so unsettled by this card trick is that there is no motion involved. It is a seemingly motionless card trick. There is no interaction between the magician that we are aware of, and no interaction between the person who sits down, between the cards. It's simply that there is a card, and that card is being picked out from the deck. Now, it's possible that there's psychology here about which card you want to pick up and which card people think about, etc. We simply don't know. This is one of the mysteries of the universe. We're not going to try to solve that here. I'm sure somebody has an answer. But what's really important here is the idea that, in a sense, motion would make it acceptable to us. That there is something happening. And it's not even that we know that there's a trick. There has to be that form of interaction that makes us believe that it is a real thing.
Yeah, motion is like a kind of hint. It suggests that is where the trick is being performed. Because we're trying to figure out where exactly is the moment of truth. Right? The moment where...
Yeah, it's sort of the
number is revealed.
If you want to say it's the becoming of the trick. Whereas if there is no motion involved in the trick, if it's just that the card is already in the deck and the person, in a sense, is like mystically drawn to that card, then it becomes a form of monism. Then the deck is the one or the all out of which the particular subject draws the essence that was already in the deck. And that makes us deeply uncomfortable. And the reason that I was introducing this card trick is that it kind of tells us about one of the problems that the Pre-Socratics were really obsessed with, which was the relationship between oneness and the relationship between not oneness or becoming. the relationship between being and becoming. Being as a form of completeness, and becoming as a form of incompleteness, a process, as it were. Anyway, I'm not going to give you a big summary of who the Pre-Socratics are, but all you have to, and actually I did. I uploaded a masterclass. So this is like a plug. If you download if you're a patron in our masterclass tier, there's a 10-minute, here's who the Pre-Socratics are, here are the Eleatics and the post-Eleatics and what they think about different things. Like, you can find that. That's not what this is going to be. That's for the masterclass patrons. Again, you can find the link to our Patreon in our bio. It's www.patreon.com/JulianJulian. And so one of the famous Pre-Socratics is Zeno. You may have heard of Zeno and his famous paradoxes, like the famous one about Achilles, whether or not Achilles can catch up to the tortoise, and can we take something and make it infinitely divisible, and so on and so forth. And the paradox that's important here is the paradox of the arrow. Do you know the paradox of the arrow? I think we did a class on this like a long time ago. The paradox of the arrow. So the way the paradox of the arrow works, I was going to illustrate here, but basically, so Zeno has this paradox. First of all, we have to say that Zeno doesn't believe that motion exists, first of all. So Zeno's is part of these Eleatic monists who believes that motion doesn't exist. So being is more important than becoming. Becoming is not something that actually exists in the world. And so the paradox that he uses is to say that when you shoot an arrow, the arrow's flying through the air, that the arrow, in a sense, is not actually moving forward. If my hand is the arrow, and the arrow is moving forward, it's simply now at one point, now it's in like a non-transitional, like a transitionary point, which for Zenos is outside of time, and now it's in another point. So it's always at rest, it's just that rest in different parts. It's a little like we're getting kind of in the realm of like Christopher Nolan's Tenet here and like the reverse motion and stuff. So for Zenos, the idea is that when you shoot an arrow, that we have the illusion of motion, which is like watching a movie. It's like cinema almost, but that strictly speaking, every part of it is motionless. Now, Aristotle is a little bit smug because a lot of this is related through Aristotle, and Aristotle's a little bit smug because Aristotle makes a very commonplace observation where he tries to prove the existence of motion. And he says that the relative speed of something depends on our perspective on it. And if you want to understand that, it's a really easy way to understand it. Well, two ways. One, if you've heard an ambulance siren, the siren sound will change depending on where the ambulance is in relationship to you. Like the sound changes.
Moving away from you versus
the pitch changes, right? It's like wee, like it totally changes. So that's something that Aristotle's already aware of. I mean, there's no like sirens back then, but that's something that he's aware of. And then the other thing that Aristotle is aware of is, if you've ever watched the Fast and the Furious movie, you know this. In a Fast and the Furious movie, there's this challenge, which is you have to make cars seem like they're going super, super fast on camera. And a lot of those cars are going really fast on camera, but there's cinematic techniques that you can use to make it seem like a car is going faster than it actually is.
Yes, the cars around them are not going fast. The cars around them are usually parked.
No.
No, really?
No, they have cameras on cars and in cars and stuff
Yeah, but
like
I mean, aren't there... Sorry, I realize this is a distraction. But don't they have scenes that are like the cars are parked and car will be driving through it to create the illusion that it's going really fast.
Right, so that's one step of it, right? Traditionally, you could say, even like Formula 1 does this, like you have a static camera and then the car whizzes past. So that suggests speed because, yeah, you're right. If a car with the camera and another car are going like this, they don't seem to be going that fast. If you have a static camera and the car flies by, it looks really, really fast. But actually, and this is something that literally Aristotle's already aware of, like Aristotle's like prefiguring the Fast and the Furious here. He says that if you take one person and another person, and one person is running like this, and you're running in the opposite direction, it will seem faster. And so what happens, and literally go to any action movie today, because every action movie with a car chase sequence does this, is they'll put a camera on a car, and then they're driving in the opposite direction of oncoming traffic, so that you're not just with the flow, but you're actually going against the flow, and it like doubles the sensation of speed. And so Zenos looks at all of that and says none of that exists, basically. Like, I mean, there's different ways to interpret Zeno, but the idea is here that there doesn't exist. Now, a lot of people tend to snub the Pre-Socratics by simplifying them. And that's super unfair because that's what Aristotle is doing. Aristotle is setting up Zeno as a straw man, essentially. And what we have here is the beginnings of the age-old battle between the idealists and the materialists. And I'm going to explain that further. But what people don't always appreciate about Zeno's paradox, about the paradox of the arrow that's moving forward and that is somehow always at rest in different positions, is that Zenos, first of all, Zenos is not an idiot. Like, Zenos isn't saying, like, he's not just trying to say things don't move, nothing moves. Like, this is the, supposedly, we have all these stories about what supposedly happened in the battle between, like, I don't know, Democritus, Parmenides, and Zenos. Like, these are all fictions, of course, right? It's like, well, prove to me that motion exists. And, like, he slowly, like, raises up his middle finger, like, something like, you know, like that kind of thing. It's all very silly. The point that Zenos is trying to make, you could argue, if you are like me and you are sort of influenced by Hegelian theory, is that what Zenos is saying is that it's not so much about motion and non-motion. It's specifically about that uncanny interstice, that crack between the appearance of motion and not motion. It's that, what is that thing that exists in between the arrow being static and the arrow being in flux? That is a really, like, that is a very, like, pregnant space, as you were. And so that's something that we want to think about here a little bit more. Sort of, what is that nothingness that exists in between the arrow moving and the arrow not moving? And maybe, perhaps, there's an entire world there. There's an entire, I don't know, an entire abyss and a void out of which meaning emerges. That's something we're going to explore. So another one of the really famous aphorisms, just hydration check here.
Misdirection, hydration check.
It's really dry.
Yeah.
We live in, like, one of the driest parts of the country, which is hard for gardening. Anyway, and so one of the most famous aphorisms from the Pre-Socratics comes to us. It's actually not from Heraclitus himself. Heraclitus takes it from another philosopher called Simplicius. Simplicius of Sicilia, I think. And it's related to us through Plato. And it's the aphorism, Pantare Uden Mene. I don't know if you've heard this one. Pantare is one. It's so ubiquitous that there's even, I think, on YouTube, a Glenn Beck video where he has, like, you know how Glenn Beck used to have, like, a chalkboard? And he used to, like, do all this crazy stuff on the chalkboard. There's one of them where he does Pantare, and he, like, completely misinterprets it. And of course somehow lands on, this is why socialists are taking over America, something like this. And so Pantare Uden Mene is, it's simply, I mean, you can translate it in different ways, but it simply translates to the idea that, sorry, it's really dry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's like I can literally, like, just taste the air in here. So Pantare translates to the idea that everything changes, everything moves, everything is in a state of flux, nothing remains. Pantare, everything is moving. And then Uden Mene, nothing remains.
Okay.
Have you heard this one before?
I feel like I've heard the, like, the more things change, the more things stay the same, but that's a different.
No, that's like contemporary.
Yeah. But I'm
so
trying to think about, like, I'm thinking about what you're saying. Yeah.
Pantare,
Yeah.
Uden Mene, which kind of rhymes nicely. Pantare Uden Mene. Again, you can understand that this was part of an oral tradition, right? You can start saying to people Pantare Uden Mene, and it simply means everything flows, nothing remains. And the way that people have traditionally interpreted this is they focus on the flowing, like the streaming, as part of the Heraclitean idea that you step into a stream. And there's no such thing as stream except the flow of water. Like, the idea of stream itself is the flow of water. The idea of a fire is there's no static oneness of fire as such. There's just the flow of, I don't know, oxygen being consumed by the flame. And so there's this process of flow, and there's no static point. And in a sense, like, where Heraclitus is being, like, a true dialectician here is that he also says you are both stepping into the water and not stepping into the water. So this thing of, like, the becoming is sort of true for everything. Anyway, I don't want to get all mystical here. That's not my point at all. I think that, like, the mystical parts of the Pre-Socratics are interesting, but to me they're not definitive when it comes to Western philosophy. In fact, there's a whole process within Western philosophy to move away from that, but that's for another fine.
Well, it's interesting to think about the way in which they are mystical about the things that we consider the domain of science, which is the study of the relationship between time and space.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting here to me is that we have the idea was always that Plato is the one who introduced the difference between materialism and idealism, on which the entire history of Western philosophy then hinges. Idealism being the idea that we have like the true forms, the essences that exist outside our consciousness, and materialism being that the truth or reality of being exists in the world as a material presence, which is more sort of where Aristotle ends up being. And so what we, and someone in the chat's asking about metaphysics, and one of the pre-Socratic ideas is also that like, between metaphysics and philosophy and the natural sciences, that divide is broken down by the Pre-Socratics. Anyway, I'm really trying to stay focused here because like there's so much
There's
that
so
I
much
want to
to talk
cover
about.
here. Yeah.
Sorry, no more
no.
misdirection.
No. I mean that's it's just fine. I mean that's always going to be the problem is like there's so much to cover and so little time in a sense. So Plato has this idea that we have the difference between the materialist and the idealist, but that's not Plato's discovery. In as much as, I mean, first of all, Socrates, but it's also Socrates and Plato relating the Pre-Socratics. And we already have that tension between idealism and between materialism existing between, for example, Parmenides and Democritus. And it all hinges on the relationship between the completeness of being versus the completeness of becoming. If you are a monist and you focus on being, and being as being a form of primordial oneness from which all, I don't know, things in the world come from, then you're essentially an idealist. You're here thinking that there's a true form, a pure form, an essence, a form of monism. And that's something that, for example, Parmenides would hold. Whereas if you're someone like Democritus, you're essentially a materialist, or you could say you're a progenitor to the materialists because you focus on becoming over being. It's not that there's a oneness of being, there's a constant process of becoming. And the becoming itself creates a form of being in the same way that the whole panta re udan mene, everything is in flow, nothing remains. Now, what I want to focus on here a little bit, and this is where, again, I've laid my cards out on the table about my own obsessions, is so many people write about panta re udan mene, and they focus on the panta re part, the everything flows, everything is in flux. And to the point where they just say panta re, they just forget about udan mene. And what I'm really interested here is the panta re udan mene part, the latter part. Udan mene, nothing remains. What is this nothing that is a remainder? What is the remainder of nothingness? What is that empty space that is created in the movement of flux, in the movement of the arrow that Xeno has? And so the sort of traditional interpretation is to say, well, everything is in flux, and so nothing is. And this would go back as a critique towards the monist, right? In a sense, nothing is as such, everything is in flux. But the funny thing is that if you look at nothing remains, nothing is you're actually giving a positive entity towards nothingness here. And so the panta re moment is important to the history of philosophy, but not so much for the flow part, which we can find in a lot of other philosophers. It's important because specifically we have the positing of a constitutive negativity. And so imagine that you had it the other way around, where you had udan mene panta re, which is nothing is, everything is in flow. And there we start cutting to the core of what that expression is, which is that everything is in flow because it revolves around a fundamental abyss or negativity. That's why things are in flow, is because there is no oneness except the oneness of sort of absolute negativity. If you want to put it in more like, I wouldn't even call it mathematical terms, but we're not having here, for a monad, for monism, we have like a primordial oneness. And that oneness can be an abyss, right? Technically speaking, an empty space. And we see this like even in like Christianity, and the earth was what is it? The earth was, no, the universe was void and
without shape, without form.
Without shape, without form, and darkness was upon the face of the earth. We have here already those themes. And upon that monism, because Christianity is a monistic religion in that sense, we have that monism onto which something comes. So there's nothing plus something. Here we're in the realm of the monist, for example, like Parmenides. But if you're in the realm of materialism and the realm of everything being in flow, if you're in the realm of constitutive negativity, suddenly it's not so much that you have a nothingness onto which something is, but you have a, I don't know how you'd put this, you have a nothingness onto which something is subtracted. It's like an always already nothingness. So it's not that we start with nothing and on top of the nothing we put something. It's that within the something there is a form of Uthing, as it were, a subtraction within the positive entity of being. So everything is in flow, and that flow itself creates a negative space, a void, in which we have not nothing as such, but we have Uthing. Now, we can take this further to like start building a conceptual framework here, which is that between Parmenides and Democritus, we have two versions of negation. This actually came up in a lecture we did like half a year ago on the role of nothingness. And it's the relationship between Uden and Meden.
Oh, that's right.
I don't know if you remember that.
Yes.
Relationship between Uden and Meden. So first of all, it's important to note here that the Greek word for one, for oneness, or like monism here, is hen, as in like a female chicken, right?
Yes.
Hen, H-E-N. For everybody listening to this as a podcast, I apologize for the glugging noises. That's a little plug here, which is that our patrons get to download all the bonus Q&As as podcast and the classes as a podcast in case you'd like to support our classes. plug alert. Okay, so we have hen, right? And hen being oneness.
One.
And then we have Uden and Meden. And I want to make sure that I don't mix them up, which one is Parmenides and which one is, I actually took a note of it here somewhere. I want to make, because this is like really important part. I also, my notes are like totally unstructured, so there's nothing that I can ever find here. I distracted myself. This is what happens. My notes are like totally unusable. I love that. I actually don't take notes for these classes, so it's just like, here are all the things I was thinking about this morning.
Notes are one of
oh
those
yeah, okay,
things
I've got them.
Yeah,
okay. So I wanted to make sure that I linked them up correctly. So we have Uden and Medhen. I know what they mean, but I want to make sure that I like really link them to the right thinker, because there's nothing worse. I don't know if you've done this when you were teaching, is you're trying to introduce something really basic, but you get it wrong, and then the students are like, what? And then say you've made it more confusing. So Parmenides, who we've introduced as an idealist here, as a monist, has the idea of Medhen, which is not one. It's a negation of oneness, which is, in principle, it is not. So we have a sort of one, and something can be one or not one.
Okay.
Right? We start with one, and then we have a not one. And then, anyway, I don't want to make
Is it like thing and nothing?
You could say, yeah.
Okay.
And then we have Democritus, who has Uden, Uden, which is something that is, it's like a factual negation. And so the funny thing is here, Parmenides' Medhen is simply a one out of which we have something that is subtracted, or something on which is on top of it. The one remains intact. Uden is a form of nothingness, but the one remains intact. And what Democritus does with Uden, so Medhen versus Uden, probably doing a terrible job explaining this. We have lecture notes, by the way. I'm going to post the lecture notes for this so you can actually read it. Uden is to say that I'm doing a bad job explaining this. Okay, let's start over for a moment. Parmenides versus Democritus. Parmenides has two types of negation. Parmenides has Medhen, and Democritus has Uden. Now, Medhen has the word hen in it. Hen being one. It is something that is not one. It is not. So something either is one or it is not one. And again, remember we introduced the relationship between something, nothing, and a thing. The nothing remains, the sort of excessive remainder that comes from being.
Right.
So Parmenides doesn't believe in becoming, first of all. Remember, Parmenides believes in being, which is why we have one or not one. It's like Zeno's arrow, essentially. We have it is like here or it is here. There's no flux here. And Democritus has Uden, which is that there is no hen anymore, because suddenly we've lost the hen. We simply have Uden. So we now have a thing. We have essentially a negation that is just a factual negation, as it were. Okay, probably. I feel like I'm being too. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm being too hard on myself here, but
no.
Okay, we'll build it up. And so we have here two different types of negation. one of them basically says that there is a primordial oneness, and that if there is a void, it is a primordial void onto which something is then added. And for Democritus, we have this idea that there is no hen, there is no oneness. Instead, there is simply a negativity that is innate to all being itself, which he calls becoming.
Yeah.
And actually, what I wanted to relate this to is to, if you go to the Bible, just to like make a little riff here, because we'll get to theology eventually. One of the things that I want to talk about is also like the way in which the Pre-Socratics are foreshadowing what will be part of the Christian philosophical tradition and of theology and all this stuff, and Aquinas and all that. So if we go to Job 26:7, Job 26:7 says, "He hangeth the earth upon nothing." And this is one of those like creationists get all like worked up. He hangeth the earth upon nothing. This revelation to Job, and at the same time, it's seemingly paradoxical because in the Bible, there's also expressions where it says God placeth the earth on a pillar, and here we already have like the same problem that the Pre-Socratics have. At least if you want to see it, if you want to take it quite seriously, and you don't just see it as like just a figure of speech, a pillar or nothingness, whatever. And there's these beautiful drawings from back then also, which have like you have like a Doric or I suppose an Ionic pillar. Because that's simpler, because we're in the realm of Christianity here. We're no longer in the realm of like frills and cherubs and stuff. So a pillar, like a classical pillar on which the earth is like placed. And so anyway, so in Job he says he hangeth the earth upon nothing. And the question is, can you actually hang something on nothing? Like what does that mean to hang something on nothing? If you've read the Terry Pratchett like Discworld series, there's this idea, what is it, that the earth, like the Discworld is like suspended on, what is it, a turtle on top of an elephant or something, right? This mystical. And that's something that like even like a philosopher like Bertrand Russell was already obsessed with, which is like, what is the, if we have like a certain logical succession of thinking about the world, one of the fundamental rules being the law of non-opposition. What is the solid ground for that? When are we on solid ground? Like, what does logic ultimately hinge on? Like, what is the concrete floor on which we can build a logical system? And that's something that goes all the way back to the Pre-Socratics here, which is like, what is the primordial starting place for being or becoming, which is the condition for thinking about the world? And this hanging upon nothing, I find it really beautiful, because it's the idea that there's, again, this constitutive nothingness, something that a nothingness that you could place the entire world on, which is a very Christian. I don't want to spend too much time on this. It's a very Christian idea. I make way too many references to the Young Pope, the Paulo Sorrentino television series, The Young Pope, and one of the central themes of that show is the idea that absence is presence. And the Young Pope is constantly being accused of the fact that like it's just a marketing trick. The Young Pope says, I'm not going to show my face to the faithful because, like God, I'm infinitely silent, and people will want to know who I am. They'll be drawn to the faith because they won't see me. And it's the theme of like how all human beings are orphans. They're all orphaned by God, and of course, the character of the Young Pope, Lenny, is literally an orphan. By the way, fun fact. Maybe not so fun.
Not so fun.
Paulo Sorrentino is himself an orphan. Like this theme of being an orphan and the idea of like the very loud silence of God and the relationship of stillness to movement, how stillness is embedded in movement itself, and presence as absence is a theological motif that exists for the Pre-Socratics, specifically as a problem. That's something that I want to point out here, is like how much it exists as a problem. To be solved. And the way in which you solve that problem has very different philosophical implications. Again, we have the emergence of idealism versus materialism, the idea that there's a primordial oneness, or that there is simply a oneness embedded in the interstices between becoming as such. That nothing, the remainder, the positive remainder, constitute negativity.
Well, I like the phrase deafening silence to sort of link back to, if we're talking about negativity, what are its aspects? Like, is it something on which you can hang the earth? And I think deafening silence is one of those, because we think of silence as the absence of sound, and yet...
Yeah, I mean, I did a whole, like, I don't want to self, like, reference here, but I I did a whole 12-week series on the role of nothingness in
Yeah.
Western philosophy. So there's a little bit of that here, simply because it's such an important starting point towards understanding the rest of the development of philosophy. So I want to briefly do a little divergence here towards something, and this is something that Zizek has written about quite a bit as well. So I'm taking this from Zizek. A lot of things that I take is from Zizek, basically. I mean, this is true for any artist, any filmmaker, any teacher, is they're just stealing things from other thinkers. Like, that's the funny thing is here, is like, you go to Plato, and we see Plato as like the originator of Western philosophy. Plato is stealing from the Pre-Socratics, and he's stealing from Socrates, first of all. I mean, he's saying this is what Socrates said. I mean, let's not...
He's the ultimate plagiarist.
Well, I mean, there's
Not
a whole.
malicious.
We'll talk about
Yeah.
this, and if you want to talk about this in the Q&A afterwards, because we do a Q&A on Discord for all of our patrons. I mean, it's not plagiarism as such.
Yeah.
Of course, we can plagiarize. Yes. Okay, that's a whole nother discussion. And so one of the things that Kant has is the idea, and something that Zizek talks about a lot, is the Kantian negative judgment. And Kantian negative judgment is about. He's again like building off of Parmenides and Plato's dialogue of Parmenides, which is, if we have something that is, it is a positive entity, and something that is not, it is a negation thereof, then usually we also have a third category, which is something that is indeterminable between those two categories. For example, let's say we talked about Zeno's paradox with the arrow. The arrow's here, then the arrow's there. What is that space between the arrow being here and being there? Does that count as being? What is that negativity? That uncanny space, if you want to use a Freudian term. And we could say the same thing for, we said there's something, and then there's the negation, nothing, and then there's also the third category, which is an Uthing. It's the negativity embedded in the process of going from something to nothing. It's the negativity embedded in becoming itself. So it's unity of being fractured from within. And that fracture is internal, in a sense. And so Kant has this idea, which is that we have a negative judgment, which is that, for example, something can be alive or something can be not alive. And then Kant says, what does it mean for something to be unalive? So to lose like the principle or the predicate of aliveness itself, something that exists as like uncanny valley between there. And what Zizek does, he relates this to essentially how zombies work, because zombies are the undead. And the reason that zombies are scary, I was actually watching the new Zack Snyder zombie film, and the Zack Snyder zombie film has the same problem, which is what makes zombies scary is that zombies are uncanny, because, and uncanny means literally in a Freudian sense, it's about something which should be inanimate becomes animate. It's something that blurs the categories between a positive and a negative entity. So we have aliveness, which is like me, and then we have someone who's dead, someone who's lifeless. And then a zombie is someone who isn't necessarily brought back to life, but is essentially a walking corpse, a sort of a, like this machine, like
Undead. Yeah.
Yeah, like pure drive, like undead, this thing that exists in between. Clearly not dead, but also clearly not alive. I mean, the drooling should be a giveaway, probably. And what Zack Snyder does in the movie is that he brings he creates this, which he takes from the Romero movies as well, Army of the Dead, that they're also sentient beings, so they start organizing like a tribal society. But the problem is that once you make zombies no longer just pure negativity, like the embodiment of the negative space between life and death, that transitional space, they're no longer scary. They're just kind of like comic. Like, that's the funny thing about and this is something that I'd really like to talk about more in the Q&A that we're going to do on Discord, is that zombies have a really odd relationship to comedy. And most zombie horror and like splatter gore horror in general is quite the Instagram died again is quite comedic.
I'm really
That's
sorry.
okay. Our Instagram live streams have been dying a lot
It's been-
recently, so
yeah,
I'm
it's
just
been
gonna reload that for people. It's okay. We'll post the YouTube version. That's exactly.
YouTube URL, Nicole.
You guys can use this as a little intermission if you want.
Yeah, coffee break.
Yeah, exactly. Okay,
Get
we're
ready.
now back on Instagram. Let's see if that works. We're now back on Instagram Live. Hello, everybody. Welcome. This has been happening a lot. We've been losing the feed a lot,
Yeah.
so that's just how it is. I realize I should be making more eye contact with YouTube. Hello, everybody on YouTube, because like if Instagram is just going to keep crashing, then this is going to be the version that we're going to have.
YouTube becomes the favorite child.
Yeah. So we're talking here about the relationship between alive, between not alive, and between the uncanny thing between those two categories, which is the undead, essentially, right? Not alive, not dead. And one of the things that is scary about zombies in that sense is that they embody that negative space between the two. It's like becoming that's become short-circuited.
Right.
It's a becoming that's no longer moving along the coordinates of all life. It's something that's like stuck. A zombie is neither alive nor dead, is stuck in that process. In the same way that we think of ghosts as being scary because a ghost is a spirit, I mean, whatever, a spirit that is detached from the process of dying.
Right.
It's something that disrupts that motion. And the idea that Kant already has and that we can trace back to the Pre-Socratics is that that disruption, that thing that resists, in Lacanian terms, symbolization. I don't want to get too Lacanian here already, but I've laid my cards out on the table, is inherent to being and becoming itself. Do you see what I mean? And so that's there. And so that's something that Zizek sort of harps on with, and it's also, we talked about this in the Q&A last week, is that if you want to understand Zizek's theory of I would rather not, the whole Bartleby thing, the proper way to understand why that's a form of resistance, you have to go all the way back to this stuff. Anyway, I did that last week. Patrons can download that. Patrons can download the episode where I talk about Zizek's I would prefer not to, and I explain it. Okay, so I think we've got 20 minutes, so you can kind of like start bringing all these themes in. If you've never joined my classes before, I practice what is known as dialectical teaching, which you could say is a pretentious way of saying that this is associative. However, it is actually quite carefully planned. Dialectical teaching is something that did not start with Hegel, actually started with the Platonic schools coming from the Pre-Socratics. And it's the idea that in order to teach something, you don't just lay out all the facts and you transfer the information. Instead, you basically put all the ingredients on the table, and then you see how they all sort of interweave.
yeah.
And then the idea is that by the end of it, they should all make sense in your head. They should be like, oh, this is why you were talking about all those things. And one of the things that Julian and I try to do is we try to teach these classes in a way where hopefully you can go back to previous classes, watch them, and you'll see them in a totally different light because you're on that process of learning. Anyway, okay, fine. I hate when we get too meta about like what we do. That's it. Just but
No, well, it's because I think we all have an experience of what education is. It's going into a classroom, it's listening to a lecture, it's doing the reading or not doing the reading, and it's very universally structured in that way. And so to try and relearn what it means to learn is really challenging.
True. Okay, well said. Well said. Okay, so we're still focusing on the relationship between the Parmenidean idea of oneness or completeness and the Democritean idea, which we've called sort of proto-materialist of the idea of becoming, and the negativity implied in all becoming. And we had the idea of panta re, uden mene, panta re being the fact that everything flows and nothing remains. And I suggested, what if we turn this around? What if we say nothing remains, everything flows? What if the nothingness is actually primordial, but not because it becomes before the flow, but it is actually something that exists within the flow itself, something that is like a crack that exists within the flow. What's important here to know, if you read more about, for example, the Heraclitian idea of panta re, is I said he's already saying you've always stepped into the water and not stepped into the water, right? When you put your foot in the stream. But people in the chat know already where we're heading here a little bit. And at the same time, for example, Heraclitus is a dialectician. And so one of the things that Heraclitus, I mean, we think he writes about this because we get it through other sources, Plato, is the idea that you are both doing and you're not doing. It's actually, and so again, to go back to Zeno's paradox, or to where we started, it's actually not to say that you stepped into the river and you didn't step into the river. It's actually to say that all stepping is also a form of unstepping. And what I mean by that is we're almost like at a proto version of like the law of relativity here. There's always like a universe in which that thing also didn't happen. Everything is constantly mirrored. And what I'm not trying to say is that we have here a scientific natural law. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. What I'm trying to say is that someone like Heraclitus is actually not talking about the pop psychology wisdom, which is that, you know, everything is moving, and so we just have to be in tune with the universe. And if we're in tune with the universe, we'll realize that our problems are meaningless because everything changes and you could be a new person every day. And like, this whole way of looking at the Pre-Socratics, which is like oddly related to how people look at the Stoics, is like sort of a fanciful way of doing self-help.
Self-help, yeah.
It's like these profound nothingness things, let's say. And that's really, I think, and part of why we think about the Pre-Socratics that way is because that's how they've been presented to us by Aristotle, by Plato, and some of the small remnants we have of them. But what's much more important to me about the Pre-Socratics is that they're making a fundamental argument about what it means to structure human thought. And what I mean by that is if you go to the origins of the Pre-Socratics, is their relationship to the gods is changing. The way in which they conceptualize the gods. One of the things that's profoundly difficult for us to understand today is how, and this was true for Christians and for Christian philosophers, this was true for the Neoplatonists, true for Platonists, was true for the Pre-Socratics, in order to have a theory of the universe, you had to have a theory that incorporated the gods. And what the Pre-Socratics achieved was to come up with a theory of the universe that created agency for the human mind. It's like the kernel of the enlightenment. It's like the beginning of a systemizing trend. And we can really see that in the transition from how deities are internalized into the system. And what I mean by that is, in the Homeric universe, we have gods who, they're not there to bring justice, in a sense, right? They're not saying we are meting out a form of cosmic order and you get punished accordingly or you get rewarded accordingly. Of course, and this is one of the really interesting questions within all Greek philosophy and classical philosophy, is what is the role of order? Does order exist?
Yeah.
Because there's these ideas like hubris, for example, which is that if you get beyond your mortal station, if you think that you are greater than the gods, you count your chickens before they're hatched, that you will be punished for it. And it's not entirely like the higher you go, the lower you fall, etc. And it's not entirely clear if this is some form of cosmic karma justice, if this is the gods simply taking subjective issue with your position in the world, if the gods themselves are subject or beholden to a kind of cosmic fate that requires that they intervene. It's not entirely unclear. And part of the shift that takes place within that Hellenic period, where we see the Socratics coming up, so it's that 5th, 6th century BC, is that we don't just have the Homeric gods. We have, oh my God, how many gods? There are gods for absolutely everything. There's deities upon deities upon deities, and there's an entire hierarchy of deities.
Right.
It's like we have little house gods, we have gods for sneezing, we have gods for this. We have little deities like patron saints almost that become associated with everything. And so what happens when you have that many types of deities is that you start having to create a hierarchy or a system of sorts. We're here almost like in the Foucauldian logic of things universe, which is like, how do the order of things, sorry, like where does that order come from? And so the gods now become no longer just gods who are these individual poetic agents who are intervening in the world. Instead, the gods become embodiments of certain natural laws or processes. For example, a god is a sun god because he embodies the sun. A god is someone who is a house god because he embodies the house, all this kind of thing. And so one of the things that people always talk about when they talk about the Pre-Socratics is the supposed transition from mythos to logos. And the way that it's usually presented is totally erroneous, which is, to my mind, which is they say, oh, we're going from mythos, which is like fiction, towards logos, which is fact. We're going from passion in mythos towards the reason of logos.
Yeah, from superstition to...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like the birth of the Enlightenment, because we've gone from like the mysticism of the tribal idiots towards the, you know, enlightened reasoned systems of logos. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because what that's doing, first of all, is it's suggesting that mythos exists in the realm of language, whereas that logos is in the realm of logic and of like mathematics and analytic thinking. But that's not true at all. Logos, and you already see from logos, First of all, we're going to do a little Greek lesson here, right? Yeah. What do you call it when, I don't have one right here, but what do you call it when there's something like on your chest?
Oh, like a logo.
A logo, exactly. Yeah, a logo is simply a sign or a symbol.
Okay.
And that's because a logos is, what is a tongue? Have you heard of a tongue in Latin? So what was called the, like, for example...
Oh, like fork tongue. I don't know.
No, if something is like the common language, we call it a...
Oh, lingua franca.
Yeah, lingua franca, exactly, yeah.
Okay,
and lingua is tongue.
Okay.
And so lingua is tongue, and lingua goes back also to the idea of logos. It is that which is spoken. A logos is a form of speech, essentially language. And so we're actually going from myth towards language. And because, I mean, first of all, logos can mean many different things, right? But I want to emphasize the language here. This, again, my structuralist influences through the concept, which is we're going from myth, which is in a sense unstructured cosmos, unstructured gods intervening and all that stuff, towards logos, which is an utterance, a language, a pronunciation, the emergence of a hierarchy, the emergence of an order. In other words, the emergence of a system. And so with the emergence of logos, we have a systemizing trend within the Pre-Socratics that then continues throughout Western philosophy. That is one of the key ingredients of Western philosophy, is that it tends to want to systemize. It wants to create these ways of explaining everything according to a system. And again, there's these biblical foreshadowings that we have here. The power of the name, the power of speech, specifically the Garden of Eden, the way in which Adam...
fruit of knowledge.
Fruit of knowledge, the way in which Adam gives names to things in the Garden of Eden, to beings. And the tree of the fruit of knowledge, which I feel like I've obsessed about in other classes already, is specifically the emergence of logos in a mythos. The Garden of Eden is this mythos space in which there is no order as such. Adam and Eve exist outside a natural order because there is no order. It's just natural. It's just a primordial nothingness. It's like an abysmal meaninglessness of just being in it. And what we have with the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge is we have the beginning of a certain self-awareness. And what does a self-aware mind do, a conscious mind do? It starts to create systems. In other words, something is not. Something is a part of this species, something is not part of it. I can eat this, I can't eat that. And so the human mind starts taking on agency as a systematizing force. And here we have this like paradoxical movement, like the Ouroboros or the Mobius strip, which is that when you start being a systemizing force, system comes into being in the world, as it were. It's like, it's not that there was system and I am this empty vessel that understands the primordial system. It's that through me, system comes into being. I become the agent of the universe knowing itself. And this is something that's really important to me because like and this is actually, I think people have become much more interested in this as like, we think more about cyborgs and the artificial intelligence is like, there's an evolution that takes place within humanity, which is the thinking about oneself and thinking about the world and becoming self-conscious and moving towards the Cartesian cogito, the supposedly self-transparent subject. And like, is there, and I don't want to go into this now, we can do this in the Q&A, is there a stage of life where human beings and the human brain is no longer needed to reflect on the world? What if we simply had artificial intelligence that could reflect on the world? Like, why is that something, like, what is the evolution of human consciousness and how does it relate to the evolution of the universe itself? Anyway, it might also be that next month we just say that there's aliens and then everything changes again. But here's what I want to go back to originally, which is the fact that when we're talking about this idea of being and becoming and the relationship of nothingness to being and becoming, the relationship to the Parmenidean Medhen or the Democritean Uden, the idealism, you could say, of Medhen, the something is principle not, there's a primordial void that constitutes being, and then the Uden, where we have this idea, the proto-materialist stance, that it's actually all about becoming and about being or not being, and the emergence of a third category, which is the liminal space between becoming and becoming something else, that undead, Kantian negative judgment part, that we have here the emergence of what I said in like Job, hanging the world upon nothing. Suddenly nothing becomes very, very important. Nothingness becomes a central category onto which the entire premise of being is. And there's something very human here. I want to mention Zizek here again, because if you've read Zizek talks a lot about this in a book called Less Than Nothing, which is like his big book on Hegel. And the cover of Less Than Nothing is it's a black backdrop, and there's a red line that crosses through it, and out of that red line comes a naked figure. And that's sort of like an illustration of Zizek's theory of subjectivity, which he says we have a primordial nothing, but it's simply a backdrop. It's not something that always already existed. It's not that there was nothing onto which something was pasted. It's that it's a backdrop that comes into focus through the thing that is there, in a sense. And what happens is at a certain point, we have a radical form of nothingness, like a new form of nothingness, the Uthing, right? That thing that is between being and becoming. And that is what he calls like the red line. And out of that red line comes the idea of the subject, which again, like what I said in the previous class, this is also like a very Lacanian idea of subjectivity, which is that the idea of the subject is the result of a certain impossibility of completeness between being and not being, between the id and the superego and all that stuff. And so if you go back to the Pre-Socratics, you can already see this as one of the fundamental disagreements between what you call like the Eleatics and the post-Eleatics, is like this monism, this oneness. Is this a oneness onto which something is pasted?
Right.
Or is it that there is a oneness in the world, the oneness of becoming, onto which then retroactively nothingness is added, subtracted by adding it?
Yeah, and this notion that the something that is added only appears to be something added because it is in contrast with nothing.
Yeah. It's sort of like, it's a bit crass, but like when you think about, for example, we can only conceive of being dead because we are alive.
Yeah.
When we're dead, we can't actually think about being dead because we have no consciousness. It's like the negative thing comes after. It's constitutive.
Yeah.
In the same way that like, and this is sort of the death drive again in the Freudian sense, it's like we move forward in life because we have this negation of our own finite life, and that's what creates the illusion of being alive as well. You and I were watching the, sort of a riff, but you and I were watching the Pixar movie Soul. And there's a certain moment where the character talks about his purpose, and he's made a fundamental mistake of misrecognition, which is he thinks that his quote-unquote spark, which is a word that the movie introduces, like you could have a spark for basketball or for teaching philosophy.
Pixar philosophy.
Well, he misconstrues, he misidentifies his spark as being his purpose. And there's like this metaphysical pre-ontic entity that looks like a Picasso painting that basically tells him, oh, you silly humans, you're so primitive. You always think that such a thing as purpose exists. Purpose is just a construct, and purpose is a construct that you imbue your life with meaning in. But what's important here, that according to the universe of Pixar, the spark still exists. And here we are, finally, back in the pre-Socratic universe. That spark is the spark of fire. It is the spark of what gives animation to the world. Fire, air, water, earth. It's those elemental forces. And those elemental forces aren't mystical. It's simply because they are part of the process of becoming. Again, a fire, as I said earlier, is not a fire in any static sense. A fire is the visual, biological, whatever you want to call it, physical result of the consumption of air and the heating up of whatever. I'm not a physicist here, right? There's no such thing as fire by itself.
Yeah.
Fire is a negative entity that emerges through the collapse of these things.
Well, it's a chemical change in a substance, and it's the process through which that happens.
Yeah, it's a nicer way of putting it. And so, in a sense, like in the Pixar movie Soul, we already kind of have that a little bit, which is that you call it purpose. You think that this is something that you're doing to fulfill your life on Earth, that there must be a metaphysical purpose outside the finiteness of your existence. And instead, what we don't have is purpose, we have spark. We simply have the principle of becoming itself, onto which then a negative space is created, which you fill up through purpose. That's like the sort of the philosophy of Soul, as far as I understand it. And what's really important here is that the idea for the Eleatics, right, because Eleatics being one of the major strains within the Pre-Socratics, the Eleatics have the logical impossibility of the void, which is also the impossibility of motion. Remember, Xeno is an Eleatic. He says, there is no such thing as motion. There is only arrow here and arrow there, which means that for them, the void does not exist. And the funny thing is, it actually takes the Eleatics, and for us to get to the post-Eleatics, it takes that problem to then create the, hey, what is the in-betweenness? And because all being, all becoming states that there is constantly also a space in which something is not already become.
Right. Well, and it's also funny to think about if you take the Pixar Soul universe and transpose it onto the Iliad. Like, is Achilles' spark the fact that he has this fundamental weakness that is going to be his downfall? Like, because to me, the Greeks and the Pre-Socratics are so preoccupied with fate and, like, there's nothing you can do to avoid your fate. Whereas for us, we don't really think about fate. We think about purpose as being something that's really positive, that's really inspiring, that really like moves us in its great potential. But for the Greeks, it's like, no, that's a curse. That's a really negative thing.
It's true. I mean, it's even slightly more complex, which is that if you read the Homeric universe, the truly tragic figures of the Homeric universe aren't the human beings who are caught up in it, because the human beings who are caught up in it still have the illusion of purpose. The tragic figures are always the gods, because the gods, and this is also where back in the realm of like Wagner's Götterdämmerung, or the ring cycle, which is that the gods are the supposed Hegelian master who have complete power over life and death of their subjects, and at the same time, they're the ones who are then bound by all of those rules.
Right.
We can talk about this in the Q&A. You and I talked about this before. There's a film I really like by Denis Villeneuve called Sicario. And Sicario 2 has the exact same premise that the Ring Cycle has, that the Homeric epic has, which is in the second movie of Sicario. I'm not even going to explain what it is. You guys, if you're with me, they say that there are no more rules. That's like the tagline of the movie is now there's no rules. Now you have full, complete power. And of course, what the movie shows is that the exact point at which you say that there are no rules, you are the complete master, etc., is the point at which you become subject, completely at the mercy of this logical system that has come out of nothing that you've created. And so the gods are the truly tragic figures in this sense, because the gods are the ones who realize that their autonomy is the fundamental illusion. Plus, they have no freedom except to be the symbolic figureheads of the existence of order. Whereas it's the human beings who, again, in a Hegelian master-slave dialectic, who find autonomous, genuine freedom, like Nietzschean amor fati, embracing your own faith. And so the gods are the sad, tragic, pathetic figures, whereas human consciousness and human agency comes into being in sort of resisting that. And this is like true for all human subjectivity, is human subjectivity doesn't mean to like have your fate. The process of human subjectivity is to say, I'm going to do the impossible. I'm going to resist my fate and sort of recode what my fate is internally. But we can talk about this in the Q&A.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I think it's really helpful because you're right. The Iliad is really tragic for the gods' perspective, and there are some really tragic scenes about that. And the point is that it's precisely because they never confront the limitations to their power, whereas humans regularly confront their limitations to their own power and agency through worship and being subject to.
I mean, it's one way of looking at it. Yeah, sure. Yeah, for sure. I'm not saying it's not a good way of looking at it, but it's one way of looking at it.
No, it's helpful.
I mean, this is going to come back as a theme because we're going to move towards talking about Plato and Aristotle. So I've cherry-picked amongst the Pre-Socratics here, but we're trying to lay out a hopefully more or less systematic argument over the course of these next 12, 13 weeks. Thank you guys for watching. Julian and I are going to hop onto the Discord right now.
Yes.
If you're a patron, starting at just $5 a month, you can join us on Discord. We're going to be recording a live Q&A for an hour. So anybody who wants to join, you can just hop over to the Discord. We're going to be going live right now for an hour. We're going to take your questions and we're going to discuss. And you can download all of that stuff as a podcast if you'd like to. So if you can't join us live, know that we're going to record it as a podcast that you can then download later. You can also join us on Friday when Julian is going to be teaching her next class.
New lecture series.
So yeah, thank you guys for joining us today. We appreciate all your support. Also, if you're watching this, we're going to be posting this class as well as previous week's class as a fully written out essay, which you can then enjoy on your own terms if you want to read it. And if you'd like to read every single class that we teach, or that I teach, because it's going to be my classes, because you're too busy with your PhD. If you really
want to read my PhD, you can, but that's different. That's going to be a couple of years away.
If you'd like to, if you'd like to read this class and every class moving forward as a fully written out 10,000 word essay, you can find that if you join the Patreon tier 4. That's the JXJ Studio tier. We're going to be sending out that stuff this week. That is our premium tier because that's the most work for us, is writing that out. And so starting this week, we're going to post every single class as a fully written out essay for our JXJ Studio patrons. And so if you go to www.patreon.com/Julian, you can find all our offerings. All of our classes are free for everybody. These classes don't cost anything. We never want them to cost anything. We want them to be absolutely freely available. We're dedicated to open access online learning. That's the goal, is to never charge. And the gamble that we made a couple months ago is we said we're going to trust that there's some patrons who believe in our dream and who want to support us in our journey of being independent educators. And so far, we've had just amazing support from you guys. It's been much, much better than we ever could have hoped. We're currently at 125 patrons, which is mind-blowing. And that starts at just $5 a month. And we super, super appreciate you. So for every class, if you're watching this, for every class, you can get a ton of perks, starting with audio downloads for every class. You can join the live Q&A. You can get lecture notes. And as of this week, we're going to start posting full written essays for my classes so that you can read along with us in the comfort of your own lounge chair or wherever you are. All right, so that's all on www.patreon.com/JulianJulian. If you're watching on YouTube, that's in the About page. If you're watching on Instagram, you can find it in the link in bio. And we are now going to hop onto the Discord, and we're going to be recording a 1-hour bonus discussion where we take your questions and we delve deeper into the topics we just discussed. To join on Discord, you can join the $5 tier on Patreon. That's $5 that gets you access to the Discord. And if you can't join us live, you can also download that as an audio download. If you're watching this today and you've thought about committing to the Patreon at some point, this would be a really, really good time to do so because we're just starting a new lecture series. We're going to be working our way through the history of Western philosophy. And it also makes a really, really big difference in our own life because this is like our project. This is what we're doing. This is our source of income, is the Patreon. And so if you've liked these classes, if you've enjoyed this class or any previous class, if you'd like to support our classes, if you'd like to access bonus materials for everything, we're looking to find maybe one person today who can join the Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/JulianandJulian. And if you'd like to be that one person, we will send you, as soon as you sign up, we'll send you a link to our Discord and you can hop on to our next live Q&A. There's a ton of stuff that we do behind the scenes, so you guys are always invited. Plus, you can download everything that we've done in the past. So if you join our Patreon today, it will get you access to everything that we've posted on Patreon. I think it's like 100 posts already. And you can keep up with all of our classes and all of our content. So thank you guys for joining today. We super appreciate you. We appreciate your support. We appreciate you being part of our learning community, part of our classes. We're just getting started. The Pre-Socratics is just the very, very tip of the iceberg. And we're going to move our way through the history of Western philosophy step by step in a very Julian and Julian fashion, I think. So thank you guys for joining. And please do take a look at the Patreon. It's like we give a sermon. At the end of this sermon, I'm doing like a little collection, which is like, we love doing this. This is our dream, to do this forever. I mean, forever is a big word, but to do it as long as we can. And it's been super, super intellectually stimulating. We hope that it also has been for you. And so if you'd like to support us in what we do, if you'd like to also get all the perks for all of our classes, please consider becoming a patron. That's www.patreon.com/JulianandJulian. Or you can find the link in the About page on YouTube or on Instagram, click the link in bio. And we're looking for one person today who can join, and then we think we've done a pretty good job.
We've done a day's worth of work.
All right, guys, we are now going to be, thank you for watching. We're going to be hopping onto the Discord. So if you're a patron, you can now head over to Discord. We're going to record a 1-hour live Q&A. If you are not yet a patron, you have 5 minutes in which I am not yet on Discord. And if you want to join the Discord live Q&A, send me a message or sign up to the Patreon, and I'll send you a personal invite because the more people, the merrier. That's always very fun. So, you're already having breakfast. I'm jealous.
having breakfast.
I'm going to go out for breakfast after this. This is my goal today.
a 5-minute breakfast break.
Yeah, so in the next, if you'd like to join the live Q&A, there's about 5 minutes where we're going to gather ourselves and you can sign up. If you'd like to join the live Q&A, simply sign up to the Patreon. That's $5. $5 gets you a month's access to live Q&As every week. And we'll send you an invite to the Discord so that you can join us right now.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys. We super appreciate you. We're now going offline, and we look forward to signing you guys up and seeing you in the Discord.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Oh, it's nice with the birds chirping.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it? It's getting warm. Whew.